In 1889, the President of the United States faced a problem that sounds almost impossible now. The federal government had too much money, not private wealth, not the fortune of industrial barons, but federal revenue. Year after year, the Treasury was collecting around $100 million more than it could spend. And that surplus was not stabilizing the country, it was slowly warping it. So President Benjamin Harrison chose a new commissioner of pensions, a man named James Tanner. That decision mattered more than almost anyone understood at the time. Tanner was no ordinary administrator. He was a double amputee who had lost both legs below the knee at the Battle of Second Bull Run when he was only 18 years old. After the amputations, he taught himself stenography. On April 14, 1865, he sat inside the Peterson House, only feet from the dying Abraham Lincoln, taking dictation as witnesses described the assassination. That was the man Harrison placed in charge of the largest government bureau in America. And Tanner made his intentions clear before he even stepped into the office. He said, "God help the surplus." Then he declared that he would drive a 6-mule team through the Treasury. But the truth is, those were not empty words. He would keep both promises. Within 4 years, 28 consecutive years of federal budget surplus would disappear, and it would never return. To understand why that promise mattered, you have to understand something about the United States that almost no one is taught anymore. From 1866 to 1893, the federal government ran a budget surplus every single year, 28 straight years, and not a token surplus either. During the 1880s, the Treasury was collecting roughly $100 million more than it spent annually, while the total federal budget was only about $265 million. That means Washington was taking in nearly 40% more than it actually needed, and there was no federal income tax, none. The entire government ran mainly on tariffs and excise taxes on whiskey and tobacco. Import duties alone supplied about 50 to 60% of all federal revenue. After the Civil War, the national debt stood at $2.8 billion in 1866. By 1894, one surplus after another had pushed that debt down to $1 billion. 64% of it had been paid off in less than 3 decades. That sounds like a triumph. But really, it was not that simple. Every dollar locked away in Treasury vaults was a dollar not moving through the economy. And the country was expanding at breathtaking speed. Railroads were spreading across the continent. Factories were multiplying. Millions of immigrants were arriving. All of that growth needed currency. It needed money circulating, changing hands, keeping commerce alive. But the government was pulling cash out of the system and stacking it in storage. The result was deflation, not mild deflation, not some abstract economic term. The kind that crushes real people. Prices fell year after year. Credit tightened. Small businesses found it harder and harder to borrow. Farmers were hit especially hard. They borrowed in the spring and repaid after harvest. But the dollars they repaid were worth more than the dollars they had borrowed. So every season, even when they paid, the debt grew heavier in real terms. On paper, it looked manageable. In real life, it was a tightening vice. If your ancestors farmed in America during the 1880s, this was the invisible weight on their backs. The surplus was not protecting them, it was quietly strangling them. Both political parties agreed that the surplus had to be reduced, but that was the only thing they agreed on. Democrats wanted lower tariffs, collect less money. Straightforward. Republicans wanted higher tariffs. Their logic sounded backward, but internally it made sense. Raise tariffs high enough, and imports would fall. Fewer imports would mean less tariff revenue. In other words, make the tax so punishing that fewer people pay it. That argument became the Great Tariff Battle of 1888, and it dominated American politics for years. The McKinley Tariff of 1890 raised average duties to nearly 50%, the highest level in American history up to that point. It also placed sugar on the duty-free list. That was not a minor adjustment. Sugar was the single largest source of tariff revenue. Removing it was supposed to drain the surplus from the revenue side. Voters hated what followed. Prices on manufactured goods jumped. Public anger surged. Republicans lost 93 seats in the House in the 1890 midterms. Even William McKinley lost his own congressional seat. But the tariff alone could not kill the surplus quickly enough. For that, they needed something even larger. They needed people. By 1889, nearly 2 million Union veterans were still alive. Most were in their 50s and 60s. Most did hard physical labor, on farms, in shops, in factories, work that destroys the body even without old battlefield wounds. And politically, they were indispensable. The Republican Party could not afford to lose them. The Grand Army of the Republic, the Veterans Organization, had more than 400,000 members by 1890 and had become one of the most powerful pressure groups in the country. The pension system had existed since the Civil War, but at first it was relatively limited. In 1866, about 127,000 claimants received a combined $15.5 million. Then Congress began widening eligibility, and each expansion built pressure for the next one. The first major detonation came with the Arrears Act of 1879. That law made pensions retroactive to the date of discharge instead of the date of application. That single change meant new applicants could receive lump sum payments covering every year since the war ended. The average payout rose above $900. In an era when annual income for many Americans was well under $800, that was life-changing money. And really, it was irresistible. Applications flooded the Pension Bureau, but the truth is, the Bureau had almost no reliable machinery to verify what was real and what was invented. In its own report to Congress in 1879, the Pension Commissioner described the system as, in his exact words, an open door to the Treasury for the perpetration of fraud. The structure invited abuse from every direction. Doctors who performed examinations were paid $1 per exam. $1. That gave them every reason to approve quickly and move on to the next case. Pension attorneys coached veterans on which disabilities to report, then took their share of the payout. Men filed claims for injuries suffered while drunk. Others claimed for accidents that happened while they were merely intending to enlist. Still others sought pensions for illnesses contracted long after the war but blamed on wartime strain. In some cases, multiple widows filed pension claims based on the service record of the same dead soldier, and the Bureau was drowning. The paperwork grew so overwhelming that the government converted Ford's Theater into overflow office, storage space for pension files. Think about that for a moment. The building where Abraham Lincoln had been shot became a giant archive for the bureaucratic aftershocks of the war that had consumed his presidency. Then came one more layer of tragedy. On June 9, 1893, the floor inside Ford's Theater collapsed. 22 clerks were killed. 68 more were injured. The building where one president had died became the building where the administrative wreckage of his war killed again. That is the point where this story stops being just about numbers on a ledger. It becomes something else, something heavier. The surplus was not simply an accounting condition, it was a political target. And the pension system was no longer just relief for wounded veterans. It had become a machine large enough to move the entire fiscal direction of the United States. This is where James Tanner stops being a colorful figure in the background and becomes the mechanism itself. Benjamin Harrison appointed him in March of 1889, and Tanner wasted no time. He moved with the urgency of a man who believed the government owed veterans more than it had ever paid them. He wanted maximum benefits for every former Union soldier who came forward. On one level, his motives were understandable. He had been shattered by war himself. He knew exactly what the country had taken from those men. But the truth is, noble intention and administrative discipline are not the same thing, and Tanner brought very little of the second. He began stripping away restrictions wherever he could. He overrode rejections. He pushed claims through. He hired disabled veterans instead of trained administrators. He drove spending at a pace the Bureau could not control. Within months, his budget was spiraling. The Secretary of the Interior had to step in and investigate. Tanner resigned after only 5 months. But really, by then, resignation no longer mattered. because what he had unleashed was already moving and Congress was ready to accelerate it. The Dependent Pension Act of 1890 was the final detonation. It granted pensions to any Union veteran who had served 90 days and suffered any disability at all, whether that disability had anything to do with wartime service or not. That is the crucial point. The injury no longer had to come from battle. It no longer had to come from service. Any disability, from any cause, at any time, could now qualify. You served 3 months, and 40 years later, your knees ache. Pension. That is how explosive the new standard was. The numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. In 1889, there were about 490,000 pensioners. By 1893, that number had surged to nearly 970,000. In just 4 years, pension rolls almost doubled. Spending followed the same curve. It jumped from $89 million to $159 million. By 1893, pensions consumed more than 40% of the entire federal budget. Pause on that. By 1889, pension spending by itself already exceeded the total federal budget of the United States from before the Civil War. A single program born from a single war had grown larger than the full cost of running the entire country just one generation earlier. But the truth is, this is the point where the story becomes dangerous to oversimplify, because the surplus era was not some clean golden age of virtue and balance. It was not a lost paradise. Those same decades of 28 consecutive budget surpluses also produced one of the most extreme concentrations of wealth in American history. By the 1890s, the richest 1% of Americans held an estimated 51% of the nation's wealth. Workers endured 12-hour days, 6 days a week, in conditions that today would be considered criminal. Farmers were being crushed between falling crop prices and the rising cost of manufactured goods made more expensive by tariffs. Children were laboring in factories. So, yes, the government had money, but fairness is not the same thing as solvency. And a treasury full of cash does not mean a society is healthy. That tension matters, because if you ignore it, you tell a false story. But if you confuse it, you tell another false story. The country had money and lacked justice. Those were separate realities. Solving neither did not make them identical. Now watch what happened when fiscal pressure met political ambition. The 51st Congress, elected alongside Harrison in 1888, came in with a Republican majority and a very clear agenda. They needed to preserve high tariffs to protect domestic industry. They needed to keep Union veterans loyal to the party. And above all, they needed the surplus gone before Democrats could use it as proof that tariff rates should be cut. So they spent. They spent on pensions. They spent on naval expansion, pushing that budget from $15 million to more than $30 million a year. They spent on river and harbor improvements in the congressional districts that mattered most. They spent on coastal defense all along the Atlantic seaboard. Fortifications rose against enemies who did not exist. Britain, the only remotely plausible threat, had been at peace with the United States for more than 70 years. But that did not stop the appropriations. They spent on silver purchases to ease the currency shortage. Every available channel was opened. Every dollar that could be directed somewhere was directed somewhere. Democrats gave the legislature a nickname that would outlive almost everything else it did. They called it the Billion-Dollar Congress. It was the first Congress in American history to authorize a budget of $1 billion. And then came one sentence, one line, from Speaker of the House Thomas Reed of Maine, that sounded at the time like a defense but now reads like a turning point in the philosophy of the American state. Reed answered the criticism by saying, "This is a billion-dollar country." But really, that line did more than defend one Congress. It announced a new governing logic. From that moment forward, the central question was no longer whether government should spend what it collected. The new question was how fast it should do it, and how broadly it should spread the money once the machinery began to turn. By 1893, the surplus had been reduced to less than $2.5 million. 28 years of accumulation, erased in 4, and then the bottom gave way. The panic of 1893 hit like a trapdoor opening beneath the entire country. Banks failed across the nation. Gold drained out of the treasury so rapidly that the federal government came close to being unable to meet its own obligations. Unemployment moved into double digits and stayed there. Railroads, which had powered so much of the boom, collapsed by the dozens. The nation entered a depression that lasted until the end of the decade. Then came 6 straight years of deficit. That reversal is what makes this episode so staggering. The same government that, only a few years earlier, had been taking in more money than it knew how to use suddenly, could not find enough money at all. And there is a hard, unsettling line running through it. The spending that wiped out the surplus also financed the silver purchases that destabilized the gold standard, helped trigger the banking panic, and helped end the entire era. It was one of the sharpest fiscal reversals in American history, and it unfolded inside a single presidential term. A surplus large enough to keep crushing the national debt was converted into a crisis large enough to help force a redesign of the nation's entire financial system. But the truth is, that redesign did not come overnight. It came later. It came in stages. And when it did arrive, it made sure that the old surplus world would not return in anything like its previous form. That restructuring came 20 years later, in 1913. But it did not arrive as one dramatic event, and that is exactly why it mattered so much. It came as 3 separate changes, each introduced as its own reform, each presented to the public as reasonable, necessary, even overdue. But when you place them together, the shape becomes impossible to miss. These 3 changes made sure the old surplus economy could never truly come back. The 16th Amendment created the federal income tax. The Federal Reserve Act created a central bank. The 17th Amendment changed the way senators were elected, separate measures on paper, but in practice, they formed a new governing architecture. The income tax changed the source of federal power. For decades, tariffs had been the main engine of revenue. Now the government had direct access to the earnings of individual workers, not at the border, not through imported goods. Directly, the Federal Reserve changed who managed the money supply. Before that, the Treasury had played the central role, and the country had lived inside the deflationary trap created by surplus extraction and monetary rigidity. The new system ended that specific restraint, but the truth is, it ended more than that. It also removed the old limits that had forced government finance to behave in a visibly narrow way. Then came the 17th Amendment, and this change is often treated as though it belonged to an entirely different story, but really, it did not. Before 1913, senators were chosen by state legislatures. That meant they answered, at least structurally, to state governments. After direct election, they answered to campaigns, public pressure, and increasingly to donors. One form of restraint was replaced by another form of dependency. I made an entire video about 1913, about what those 3 changes meant and who designed them. But the essential point here is simpler and much more uncomfortable. The surplus economy did not just fade away, it was replaced. It was replaced by design, by structure, by a new system built piece by piece after the old one had been politically exhausted, financially destabilized, and publicly discredited. James Tanner kept his promise, and in doing so, he became part of the transition. He helped set in motion the spending patterns that emptied the Treasury within 4 years. But what makes his story even more striking is what happened after he left office. After resigning, Tanner opened a private law practice. His specialty was helping veterans win pension claims against the federal government. Think about that carefully. The man who nearly broke the system from the inside, then spent decades profiting from it on the outside. But the truth is, that is not just irony. That is a perfect reflection of the age itself. He lived until 1927. He died at 83 years old. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery, not far from the graves of the men whose pensions he fought so hard to expand. And now look at the country he helped reshape. Today, the national debt is approximately $39 trillion. That works out to roughly $17,000 for every person in the country. Interest payments alone now exceed $1 trillion a year. The federal government pays more in interest on its debt than it spends on defense. The last time Washington ran a budget surplus was 2001. Before that, the surpluses of the late 1990s were the first since 1969. And still, none of those brief moments came anywhere close to the old pattern. The 28-year streak from 1866 to 1893 remains the longest run of budget surplus in American history. Nothing since has matched it. Nothing has even seriously tried. And that fact proves something most people are never asked to think about. It proves that a government can function without taxing personal income. It proves that the financial architecture most Americans now assume is permanent, the income tax, the central bank, the culture of chronic deficit, was not some law of nature. It was constructed within living memory of their great-grandparents. Your great-great-grandparents lived in a country that owed less money every year. You live in a country that owes more every second. Every structure has a construction date. That is true of buildings. It is true of empires. And it is true of financial systems. But really, the question is never just when the structure was built. The deeper question is whether anyone still remembers why. When a country has too much money, someone will always step forward to solve that problem. That happened in 1889. It happens in different forms now. But the question almost nobody asked then, and almost nobody asks today, is the only one that truly matters. Who benefits when the fixing is done? 28 years of surplus, then more than 130 years of debt. Buildings often last longer than the reasons they were first constructed. Financial systems do too. The architecture of American debt was not inevitable. It was assembled deliberately, piece by piece, between 1890 and 1913. And the men who designed it have long since disappeared, leaving behind the system but not the explanation. The surplus did not die of natural causes. It was spent. It was restructured. It was replaced by a framework that guaranteed it could not return in its old form. James Tanner promised to destroy it, and the truth is, he succeeded far beyond anything even he could have imagined. If you made it this far, leave your thoughts below. Like, subscribe, and stay with me for the next story.